The human mind is like an endless ocean. On the surface, we see the waves, feel the currents, and bask in the sunlight. But beneath, in the depths we rarely visit, lie mysteries and creatures we've never truly faced. This is how Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, might have described our relationship with what he called the shadow. In our journey today, we'll explore this fascinating concept that Jung believed was essential to understanding ourselves. The shadow isn't something to fear, though many of us do, but rather a part of us waiting to be acknowledged, understood, and integrated. Jung once wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." These words capture the essence of what we'll be exploring, how the parts of ourselves that we deny or push away don't simply disappear. Instead, they grow stronger in the dark corners of our mind. Imagine walking down a street on a sunny day. Your body casts a shadow that follows you everywhere you go. You can try to run from it or ignore it, but it remains stubbornly attached to you. Jung's psychological shadow works in much the same way. It's the collection of traits, impulses, and desires that we've hidden away from our conscious minds and from others. But why do we create this shadow in the first place? The answer lies in our childhood. As we grow up, we quickly learn that certain behaviors are rewarded while others are punished. A child who shows anger might be scolded, while one who shares toys is praised. Over time, we begin to identify with the good parts of ourselves, the parts that earned us love and approval, and push away the bad parts that brought rejection or shame. Consider the story of Jekyll and Hyde but Oz, which Jung himself referenced in his work. Dr. Jekyll was the respectable, kind doctor who represented the socially acceptable persona. Mr. Hyde embodied all the dark impulses Jekyll repressed: his aggression, his selfishness, his desire for pleasure without responsibility. This classic tale serves as a powerful metaphor for what happens when we completely disown our shadow. It doesn't vanish, but instead takes on a life of its own. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate, Jung cautioned. This profound statement highlights the real danger of ignoring our shadow. It doesn't render it powerless, but rather gives it more control over our actions. Take, for example, the person who strongly condemns a particular behavior in others while secretly engaging in it themselves. We've seen this pattern repeatedly with public figures who crusade against certain actions only to be discovered later participating in those very activities. This is what Jung would call projection, seeing in others what we refuse to see in ourselves. One powerful example comes from folklore. In many cultures, there are stories of people who fear the wolf or some other wild creature, only to discover that they themselves can transform into that very beast. Werewolf legends, for instance, that speak to this universal human experience of containing both civilized and wild natures within us. When the moon is full, when our conscious control is weakened, the beast emerges. But Jung didn't see the shadow as something simply to be feared or eliminated. Unlike some religious or moral traditions that frame certain aspects of human nature as purely evil, Jung took a more balanced approach. He believed that within our shadow lie not only our destructive impulses, but also our vitality, creativity, and spontaneity. Consider what happens when we heavily repress our anger. Not only might it emerge in unhealthy, explosive ways, but we also lose access to the healthy assertiveness and boundary setting that anger, when appropriately expressed, can provide. In pushing away our capacity for anger, we may also push away our ability to stand up for ourselves and others. Jung shared the story of a monk who dedicated his life to removing all anger from his being, only to find himself unable to defend a young person from harm when the situation demanded it. In rejecting his shadow completely, he had lost access to necessary aspects of his humanity. This leads us to perhaps the most challenging aspect of Jung's teaching: Shadow integration. Jung didn't believe we should simply accept every impulse and act on it. Rather, he advocated for a process of becoming aware of our shadow, understanding it, and finding healthy ways to express the energy and needs it contains. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, Jung wrote. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This recognition is often painful. It means acknowledging that we're not always who we pretend to be, even to ourselves. A beautiful example of shadow work appears in the ancient Buddhist story of Milarepa, who encountered demons in a cave during his meditation. Rather than fighting the demons or running away, he invited them to tea. This represents the attitude Jung suggested we take toward our shadow, not battling it or fleeing from it, but acknowledging it and bringing it into conversation with our conscious self. The journey of shadow integration isn't a straight path. It involves dreams that disturb us, moments where we react in ways that shock us, and painful recognitions of the gap between who we think we are and how we sometimes behave. It requires tremendous courage to look at the parts of ourselves we've been taught to despise. Jung himself said, "There is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection." This paradoxical truth suggests that our flaws and darker impulses are not obstacles to our development, but necessary components of a complete self. Consider the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, making the cracks and imperfections the most beautiful part of the piece. Shadow work follows a similar principle. The places where we've been broken or where we acknowledge our imperfections become sources of unique strength and beauty. The process of shadow integration changes not just how we see ourselves, but how we relate to others. When we acknowledge our own capacity for selfishness, cruelty, or deception, we become less quick to judge these qualities in others. Our compassion expands because we recognize the universal human struggle to come to terms with the fullness of our nature. A story Jung often told involved a conversation with a Native American elder who explained that within each person live two wolves, one embodying qualities like greed, anger, and envy, and another representing peace, love, and kindness. When asked which wolf wins, the elder replied, "The one you feed." Jung might have added that the healthiest approach isn't to starve either wolf, but to acknowledge both and channel their energies wisely. As we come to the end of our exploration, it's worth reflecting on how shadow work might look in daily life. It begins with curiosity rather than judgment when we find ourselves having a strong emotional reaction. Instead of immediately defending our behavior or condemning others, we might ask, what does this reveal about me? What part of myself am I seeing reflected here? Dreams provide another window into our shadow. Jung believed that figures in our dreams often represent disowned aspects of ourselves, the threatening stranger, the helpless child, the wise teacher. These may all be parts of us seeking acknowledgement and integration. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This challenging invitation remains as relevant today as when he first offered it. In a world that often encourages us to present only our most polished and perfect selves, Jung's psychology calls us toward wholeness rather than perfection. The shadow isn't our enemy, but a neglected part of ourselves waiting to be known. When we have the courage to turn and face it, we discover not just the limitations we feared, but also unexpected strengths and a more authentic way of being in the world. As the poet Rumi wrote centuries before Jung, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Perhaps our shadows and our willingness to explore them are not what diminish our light, but ultimately what allow it to shine more fully.